want you to imagine that you're finding yourself overwhelmed with your thoughts and your feelings because you are trying to make what feels like an impossible decision. Perhaps you're thinking about leaving a religion that misaligns with part of your identity or your values, or maybe you just don't believe in it anymore, and yet there'd be familial shame or a lack of the community you've built within that institution. Maybe your relationship or marriage has turned sour or isn't what it used to be, but there's all this history keeping you together, or maybe even dependence. You could find yourself being highly stressed at work, or perhaps your job doesn't quite align with your values, but the pay's all right and you're secure there. So thinking about leaving feels like a massive risk for you. All three of these are examples of what feels like impossible decisions, choices that we could ruminate and worry around because whatever direction we choose sucks. This video is for you. It's about trying to manage these choices that feel impossible, using a skills-based approach to therapy with a bit of psychoeducation called dialectical behavioural therapy, or DBT. And I'm going to very briefly teach those three skills. The first one I will go over is called cope ahead. And I'll also look at cope ahead in another way by talking about the magic wand question. Both of these two are around addressing the fear we might feel in advance of a situation by realizing that it's not the end of a road, that there will be options we can use to progress afterwards. The second skill I will cover is called cost-benefit analysis, and that can take something that feels quite overwhelming and full on our emotional mind, and it can break it down so we have got numbers on either side. So that stops it feeling quite so emotional and makes it a bit more cognitive, and then it can make it easier for us to make a choice. And then the third skill that I will teach is radical acceptance, which is about when we don't really have a choice at all around what to do. And it's just about accepting the situation because we can't change it. So why invest all our resources into trying? So, cope ahead. If you have ever done a improv class or you're into things like tabletop role-playing games, you'll be very familiar with the and then question, with imagining ourselves in a situation that is highly challenging and then thinking about what it is that we might do to progress. And cope ahead uses an element of that. Worrying about a situation and incessantly replaying what will happen and how it will be awful and overwhelming can feel like we're being productive, like we're actually thinking about it, but it's actually a payout. What we're doing instead is embracing worry, which causes us to suffer, rather than the suffering that we're going to face with the choice or daunting situation that's coming up to our impossible decision that we're basing this video on. If you've done any CBT, you might have heard of catastrophizing, of thinking about the worst case scenario, and that being framed as a very bad thing, as a cognitive distortion. Whereas cope ahead flips that on its head. It looks at the worst case scenario, it looks at what we're afraid of, what's daunting, what's bringing up all these feelings of fear, and it imagines what we would do if we were actually in that situation, facing the thing that is hard for us. And that's the essence of this skill. If you were facing something that was difficult, if the thing that you're putting off actually happened, if you made either of those impossible choices, how would you cope? What would you do then? What would the next step be? And that helps us with the fear of it, because it's not a catastrophe, it's not the end of the world. Even the thing that we fear most, that causes most suffering, well, there's way forwards. And we can apply that for other things outside of difficult situations. Let's say there's something about to come on, like a bereavement, which would be utterly awful. Well, again, we can use cope ahead to think, what would we do? What would we change? What actions, what thoughts, what skills would we use? And like all good DBT skills, there are steps in how to do this. And the recommendation is to write these down. There's something about having a pen and paper that makes things a little bit more real and concrete, brings it into the world and slows our busy worrying brain down a little bit so that we can actually process it. Plus, with a skill like Cope Ahead, we can even go back to it afterwards and look at that thing when we're struggling with the intense feelings as a consequence of this impossible decision, and then we can progress with it. So write it down. And step number one on Cope Ahead is to describe the situation. And like I say, write it down. Describe what it is that is the impossible choice, or is the thing you're facing, and write down the situation, the thoughts that arise in you, any feelings or fears, for example, that are there. Be very concrete and write down what the situation is. So, in our first example about leaving faith, it might be you say something along the lines of, I have been a Christian for many years, but that conflicts with my sexuality and I don't really believe it anymore. But I have many friends that I have met in the church, and my parents are very Christian, and I worry about disappointing them and losing all my friendships if I distance myself from the faith. So that's writing it down in lots of details. You've talked about the situation, how it conflicts, why it's an impossible choice, and the consequences that might be there from making that choice. The second step is to think about some problem solving skills that you could use to cope with that. And if you were doing a full DBT program, then you will be learning lots of different skills for interpersonal effectiveness. So how to manage your relationships and talk with people, distress tolerance when things feel like they are big and overwhelming, because those feelings are likely to come up if you were to action leaving the church or staying and feeling compromised. Emotional regulation, so how to sit with those feelings and how to be able to shift emotions when they're feeling uncomfortable, and mindfulness, just boosting self-awareness for how we can be present with the discomfort. But if you aren't familiar with DBT skills, that's really cool as well. And instead, for this second stage where we are thinking about what we could do to cope, just think about what options you could have. Plan ahead. Think about what you could do when difficulties arise, what those difficulties might look like for you if you were choosing to either stay in the church, even though it conflicts and you don't believe in it, or to leave the church and then have all those consequences with your relationships, and maybe you might be shamed or distanced because of it. So second step is thinking about what skills you could use, or ways of problem solving so that you could cope with this impossible choice. Our third stage is to actually imagine ourselves being in that situation where we have made the impossible choice and are now left with the consequences, or where something that we're dreading a little bit has happened, and now we're in it. Now, not everybody thinks in the same way. Some people are very visual thinkers. Their minds are a little bit like a video or an MP3 going across. Other people think more in words, or in a kind of much more cognitive style. Neither of those are wrong. But this is what I talked about earlier when I was saying that, people like D&D or improv might enjoy this, because this is what this third stage is about. It's about imagining we are actually in that situation and coping. We're there and we're coping, we're thriving. What's that like? What does that feel like? And it takes something that is quite big and overwhelming, like a decision to leave your faith, for example, and it makes it more tangible. It can help with our worry about that, because rather than being in the overwhelm, we're actually kind of visualizing what it feels like to cope. we are coping ahead. And then the final stage of cope ahead is to actually rehearse and practice the skills that you've come up with in the second stage, so that when that third stage that you've imagined comes, you are competent to do it. Imagine, for example, that I had put on an amateur play and I wanted you to be in this play. You would rehearse, you would learn lines, you would feel familiar with how you act and move around, so that when you're on the stage, you're not picking up a bit of paper trying to read your lines. And it's the same with many of these DBT skills in general. You don't do the skills for the first time when you're actually in the impossible situation or facing distress. You practice them and rehearse them in advance so that when it actually happens, it feels more natural, spontaneous, rehearsed, congruent, not as though you're bumbling around trying to do these skills. So final stage is to rehearse and practice the skills or the interventions or whatever you came up with, so that when you make that impossible decision, you are able to cope. I also mentioned the magic wand question. This isn't a DBT skill, but it's something that you may have encountered if you've had therapy in the past. And it's that question where your therapist might ask you a question along the lines of, if I had a magic wand and I flicked it, what would that look like in that situation? What are you hoping for ideally? So you might think about that magic wand question, or if I could click a button and life changed, or if I could jump forwards in time 2 years and see the outcome, what would that look like? And that might just help to give a little bit of clarity, a bit of clarity on the things that we are really scared of or dreading. And then once we've got a real good picture of the stuff that we're not particularly coping with, then that can inform the whole cope ahead, because then we can see maybe it isn't about leaving our faith. Maybe that's not the thing that actually fills us with dread. Maybe the thing that actually fills us with dread is being a disappointment as a son. Maybe the biggest thing that fills us with dread is not having any friends. Maybe it's feeling as though we are failed, or we are a failure. We failed our faith, whatever it is. Maybe it's some kind of guilt that we've introjected as a child about being a good, sinless person. So magic wand question, you can do it in parallel with cope ahead. And like I say, it's really just about informing you around what it really is that's distressing you. Our next skill is the cost benefit analysis, which sounds very fancy and difficult, but essentially it is a glorified pros and cons list, where we are scoring each thing that we come up with. And that helps us to have a numerical value on whether we should do this thing or not do this thing. So this video is on impossible choices, so we will stick with that, and let's go through our second example, which was leaving a marriage that's gone sour. So we'll look at a cost-benefit analysis for that. But it can also be really useful for changing behaviours. Let's say, for example, we are in active addiction, that alcohol has been a bloody good way for us to cope when things are distressing. It gives us routine, all those kind of things. We can look at the costs of drinking, the benefits of drinking, the costs of doing something alternative in recovery, and the benefits of doing something alternative in recovery. But we will specifically in this example look at a cost-benefit analysis of leaving a fictitious marriage. And I want to put a quick caveat that I'm very happy in my marriage with my wife, and this isn't a personal thing I am exploring, but a example. So the first thing we are going to do is, again, write it down on a bit of paper so that it sticks in our mind and we can look at it. First thing we are going to do is we're going to draw up a grid, and I've stuck a photo of said grid for exploring whether or not we should leave our sour marriage, just to my left. So in the top column, you are going to put the costs of staying in that activity. Next to that, you will put the benefits of staying in that activity. Next row down, we will be looking at the benefits of doing an alternate activity. So for the top row was about staying married. The bottom row in this case is about divorce. So the benefits of doing an alternate activity, and then the costs of doing a alternate activity. As Neil Buchanan in Art Attack used to say, here's one I made earlier. So once you've got your quadrants up, think about points that you can put in each one of those 4 boxes. And those points can be very practical things. They can be thoughts that are there. They can even be a little bit more abstract. So one of mine was something like, I would feel calmer. It's very abstract, but feel free to be very unfiltered and just put some points in every single one of those boxes. Now, in my example, you've probably noticed that I've put 5 points in each box. You don't have to do that. You can put as many points on either side as you want to. It doesn't particularly matter. It's more about trying to get a numerical value to help you with a decision. So don't worry if you've got 20 points on one side and only 2 or 3 for the other. Our next stage is to number all of those different points we've put them on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is very important to you and 1 is not so important to you. It's a point you put on the list, but it doesn't particularly matter. So rate all of them, and I'll pop the list back on the screen to show you the ones that I have already made. And that helps you to see not only the reasons for and against your decision, but it actually quantifies it so that you have more of a sense of how important each of those reasons are. The final step of cost-benefit analysis is to add up all of those numbers, and that will give you a score for each of your quadrants. You can then do a little bit more maths, and calculators are totally allowed for all of this, and add up the top and the bottom rows and then compare the left and the right column. Now, there are 2 things that might happen with the results. The first is that one column will be a much bigger number than the other. And that can be really soothing, because then you're getting a lot of validation that one choice, even though it's uncomfortable and the decision still feels impossible, that one choice is much more obvious than the other. In my fictitious example, the scores were very, very close together. It was 35 versus 33. And that can also be telling and helpful. What that sort of says is that either choice is okay. And this is a sense of reframing the problem. So one thing you might think, if the scores are very similar, like in my example, is I am stuck, whatever I choose, both options are terrible, I can't make this impossible decision. But another way of looking at it might be to say, whichever choice I make, so in this case, whether to stay in this slightly abusive marriage or to leave the marriage, whichever choice I make will have fairly equal consequences. So it doesn't matter actually which choice I do make. What does matter is simply that I make a choice, because what I'm doing at the moment in worrying is prolonging the suffering, whereas choosing to make a decision, as painful as it might be either way, either to stay or to leave, will cease the dilemma of having to choose. The final skill that we're going to be covering when trying to make an impossible decision is radical acceptance. And radical acceptance may be the easiest of the 3 to say or to name, but probably the hardest one to actually practice or do. Radical acceptance acknowledges that we put an awful lot of energy and cognitive and emotional resources into trying to change things that we cannot necessarily change. And rather than trying to make those things be any different, radical acceptance acknowledges that we can't change them. And quite the opposite. it actually accepts them. It steps into our reality in this moment with all of the difficulties, the feelings, the worry that we might feel. It just accepts it. And that can be really liberating because we are no longer putting resources into something that we cannot change. What radical acceptance is not is approving. So an example of radical acceptance is, let's pretend, like many people who have learnt DBT skills, that we have had some horrendous traumatic things happen to us in our childhoods. We can't change those things. They've happened in the past. We can't say that they were right for us to experience. It was wrong. It was immoral. It's really human to feel rage over those things. What radical acceptance is doing isn't saying that it was good, we welcome it, or we want it. What radical acceptance is doing is saying it happened, and there's nothing that I can do to change that it happened. And so I am going to accept it. I'm going to give up investing resources into trying to block it. Our third example was a job that we were finding really stressful. It didn't align with our values. We didn't enjoy it, but the money was good and we were unsure if we should leave. Now, this is actually a choice that we have control over. We can choose what to do, and there are outcomes. So cope ahead or cost benefit would be better skills to use in this instance. But let's shift the scenario slightly, and instead let's say that we have signed up to a 1-year contract, a tenure. So we know that we are going to be in this job that we dislike, that causes us stress, that we are struggling with, that is in some way unethical. We're stuck in this role for a solid year, and that is something that we cannot change at all. So it might be that we think about some other skills for what we're going to do afterwards, that we cope ahead and we practice like doing our CV up, and we do some values exercises from my previous video, and we look at what our values are. In fact, check that video out if you're thinking about trying to find your ideal career. But for the next year, we know that we're going to be working in that role, and using that year to feel resentful or angry or upset or distressed at the fact that we are stuck there isn't going to be helpful. We're just going to be burning our resources onto something that we cannot change. So instead of resisting being in that job for a year, radical acceptance is embracing that we are there. We are choosing to be stuck because we have no other option. We are stuck in that role for a year. So we're choosing the thing that is unpleasant to us. We are radically accepting it. And in so doing, we're not experiencing the angst that comes from resisting our reality. We're embracing our reality as crap as it is. If you are looking to write some stuff down, then I don't have quite as nice step-by-step guidelines for this one. But the first stage for radical acceptance is to work out the extent to which you can control this situation. So is this something that is completely within your control? In which case we need to do something about it. Is it something that we can influence a little bit but cannot control? In which case we're looking for a bit of a blended approach between somewhat accepting it and somewhat looking to change it. Or is it something that we have pretty much no control or influence over? In which case radical acceptance is really the way forward. The first thing I would like you to do is to become aware of the fact that there's a situation that you are resisting and cannot particularly change. And you could do that using the mindfulness skills of self-awareness. Or you could just think about a situation that's causing you to have quite a lot of of strong thoughts and feelings, and write out specifically what that situation is. I'd then like you to look at the causes of that situation, the things that have contributed towards it, the facts of the matter. So, what happened that caused you to get stuck in this career that you're stuck in for the next year? As you're doing that, notice any feelings that are coming up, maybe a sense of anger or lowness. Just notice the feelings that are there, because you're getting a holistic idea of your resistance to accepting it. And then our last stage is actually doing actions which result in acceptance. One big skill in DBT is opposite action. So if we are feeling sad, like smiling, it looks a bit psychopathic, doesn't it? Smiling actually kind of makes you feel a little bit happier. Willing hands, putting your hands up as though you're embracing a situation. So acting in a way that you would act if you were acceptant. Using the imagery that we used in Cope Ahead, imagining what it might look like if we made that choice. In the same time, you can use imagery to what it might be like to be peaceful, but actually be in this dilemma. So what would it look like for you to be peaceful? Some people can find mantras helpful. So there might be certain sayings in AA, for example. The serenity prayer, give me the wisdom to accept the things I cannot change. Some things like that can help to bring some comfort and acceptance to stuff that's difficult. I think the biggest thing to say with radical acceptance, like I mentioned at the start, is it's a very easy thing to talk about, but it's a bloody hard thing to do. And it kind of feels like you do it in waves. So there might be a sense of acceptance that you do on paper, that the physically writing down, I'm in this role for a year. And then you just might keep encountering that over and over again. You might have accepted it on paper, but you haven't really accepted it in your thoughts, and you notice your thoughts are returning to ruminating on it. And it's just about bringing it back to that statement of you've accepted it. It might be that you've kind of accepted it in more than one way, but then there are strong feelings that are coming up with traumas. So the one I talked about at the beginning about a lot of childhood traumas, it might be that you're getting flashbacks, or that those traumas kind of feel there in the body. Acceptance is a process. It's not a light switch that you just do and it's there. It's kind of like a commitment, a discipline. And just reassuring ourselves that accepting it, eating the shit sandwich, accepting it isn't condoning it. It's not saying that we're okay with it. We can accept being stuck in this stressful, unethical career that we have pretended to be in, without thinking, I already love it and it's my kind of thing. We're not trying to gaslight ourselves. We're just trying to act in a way that is accepting, because that helps us to be peaceful. It helps us to not be fighting against it. And another really common thing with many other DBT skills is about investing in other areas of our lives. Most of the emotional regulation skills are around that. So if this is an area of our life that's really difficult to accept, our stressful job, what would it look like to acknowledge that that's stressful, and then just to invest in other areas of life that are more nourishing and don't deplete us so much? What would it look like to be liberated? And that's a really nice thing about radical acceptance. It's thinking about the benefits, not just I won't be spending my resources on worrying about something I can't change, but what would life be like for me if I could spend those resources on my hobbies, my health, my friends, my family, my development? How nice would that be? There are some wonderful, wonderful benefits of radical acceptance. I said the word brief at the beginning of this video, but it would be a brief teaching of the skills, and then this video has ended up being like half an hour long. So thank you so much for bearing with me and listening to all of this. I hope some of it has been helpful. There are some other really great websites where you can find out more about each of these 3 skills that I've mentioned. I'll also write an article where I've kind of summarized a lot of these points if you would like to reread that or rewatch a section. But I think of you. I do. I think of you watching this and just hope that you're able to find answers and peace from the worry that comes from not being able to accept an impossible situation. My name is Simon. I am a counsellor based online or face-to-face in Oxford. My specialism, the thing I work with most, is people who are stuck in patterns of self-blame. And that comes up a lot in things such as neurodivergence, bereavement, addiction, etc., etc. If you would like to work with me, then do contact me. My website is www.simonslistening.co.uk and my email address is simonslistening@protonmail.com. You can check out some of my other videos. I mentioned the one before on finding purpose, the myth of having a calling in life, and that one will break down values, which is a really useful thing to do if you're looking at what aligns with you in your life. There are also other videos which have sort of DBT themes to them. So the video on mindfulness for toe stubbing or the quadrat challenge are both very much about mindfulness skills of self-awareness. And if you would like to leave a comment on anything that you have found helpful or any other tips for people who are stuck in that position of making a impossible choice, then really welcome that. I'm quite a small channel and don't get a huge number of comments, so because of that I will more than likely read and respond to them. Just bear in mind the confidentiality thing, that anything you post on YouTube is out in the public domain. So be safe. Be safe. Have a really peaceful day. And thank you for listening. Bye.